I stepped onto the Eclipse Lounge's polished deck, the Mediterranean wind catching my hair as the ship cut through midnight waters. 3 weeks. That's how long it had been since I'd packed my research equipment, left Royan's suffocating Florence apartment for the last time, and finally remembered how to think without apologizing for it. Tonight was supposed to be my private celebration. Just me, a virgin mojito, and the knowledge that in 2 weeks I'd be starting at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in San Diego. Real research. The kind I'd dreamed about since defending my thesis 5 years ago, before everything with Royan had slowly consumed my curiosity along with my confidence. The lounge interior gleamed like a jewel box, all chrome and crystal with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the moonlit sea beyond. White leather seating curved along the perimeter, and a magnificent bar dominated one wall, bottles backlit in shifting colors that reminded me of bioluminescent plankton. It wasn't the kind of place I could normally afford, but I'd saved for 18 months to book this cruise. 1 week of pretending I was the kind of person who belonged in spaces this beautiful. I claimed a high-top table near the windows, ordered my mocktail, a virgin mojito with extra mint, because I needed clarity more than oblivion, and pulled out my phone to message Irina. She'd been my anchor through the breakup, letting me ugly cry in her Kiev apartment via video chat at 4 in the morning, reminding me that leaving was survival even when loneliness made me doubt. Position confirmed. Start date September 15th. Celebrating on luxury cruise. Wish you were here instead of delivering twins. Her response came immediately. You deserve this. Send photos. Don't let any Italian men near your drinks. I love you, Sestro. I smiled at her using the Russian word for sister, then set my phone face down as the bartender approached with my mojito. It arrived in a copper mug perfectly garnished, the mint leaves so fresh they released their scent before I even lifted it. I raised the glass to myself in a silent toast and took that first sip, savoring the lime and mint and the knowledge that I was finally truly free. That's when I saw him. Before we dive in, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit that subscribe button if you are new here. Smash the like button if you're already hooked and drop a comment letting me know what country you're watching from. I love getting to know each of you. Also stay tuned because tomorrow's story is going to be just as epic, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's get back to the story. Royan stood at the lounge entrance, his linen shirt somehow unwrinkled despite the sea air, scanning the space with that particular intensity I'd spent 3 years learning to dread. My stomach dropped. This couldn't be coincidence. The Azure Tranquility was a 16-day Mediterranean voyage, the most expensive cruise line operating these routes, deliberately chosen because Royan could never afford it on his adjunct professor's salary. He'd followed me here, or worse, he'd been tracking me somehow. Our eyes met across the crowded lounge. His face did that thing it always did, rearranging itself from whatever he'd actually been feeling into that practiced expression of wounded devotion. He started walking toward me and I considered fleeing to my cabin. But running would mean navigating darkened corridors alone, and he'd just follow. At least here there were witnesses. Wealthy tourists, ship's staff, the bartender who'd already glanced at Royan with professional wariness. Svetlana. He slid onto the stool across from me without being invited, his Italian accent thicker than usual, which meant he was agitated. I've been trying to reach you. I blocked your number, Royan. That should have been a clear message. We need to talk. His voice carried that edge of desperation I'd learned to recognize, the one that preceded hours-long circular arguments where my exhaustion became his victory. You can't just throw away 3 years without at least hearing me out. Every instinct screamed at me to leave. But something stubborn rose up, some need to prove I wasn't afraid of him anymore, that his power over me had died the moment I'd walked out. One conversation, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. You say what you need to say and then you leave me alone. Permanently. He ordered whiskey neat. The bartender brought it quickly, clearly reading the tension at our table. Royan settled back like we were old friends catching up instead of what we actually were. A woman trying to escape and the man who couldn't let her go. I was only half listening to his rehearsed apologies, the same ones he'd cycled through for months, as if repetition would make them true, when I became aware of someone watching us. Not the casual glances you get in crowded lounges, but focused attention that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. In a curved booth near the bar's far end sat 4 figures, clearly in the middle of some business discussion. Documents spread on their table, voices low and serious despite the lounge's festive atmosphere. But one of them, the one who commanded the space even while sitting still, had his attention fixed on our table. On me. He was striking in a way that made my breath catch despite everything. Dark hair swept back from a face that could have been carved from marble, strong features that suggested Eastern European ancestry, an ornate coat with gold embroidery that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than on a cruise ship. But it was his eyes that held me, pale and intense, watching with predatory focus that should have frightened me but instead felt oddly protective. I looked away quickly, heat rising to my face. Royan was still talking, oblivious as always. "I need to use the restroom," I said, cutting him off mid-sentence. I needed distance, needed to think. Maybe I could slip out through the side exit, avoid this whole conversation. The bathroom was mercifully empty. I gripped the marble sink, staring at my reflection. My mascara had smudged slightly from the sea wind. My auburn hair was a mess despite my best efforts. What was I doing? I should have left the moment Royan walked in. I fixed my makeup, took several deep breaths, practiced the firm boundaries Irina had helped me rehearse. Then I headed back out. The atmosphere in the lounge had changed. I felt it before I understood it. Conversations seemed quieter, people's attention subtly shifted toward something happening near my table. Royan sat alone, looking increasingly uncomfortable, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead despite the lounge's perfect climate control. But standing beside my table, holding my copper mug in his hand with the careful precision of someone handling evidence, was the man who'd been watching me earlier. Up close he was even more imposing. Tall, easily 6'3" or taller, with the kind of controlled power that suggested he could be very dangerous if he chose. The ornate coat I'd noticed was even more anachronistic in person. Victorian-era styling with intricate gold thread work, fastened with antique brass buttons. His three companions had shifted positions without seeming to move. One now near the bar, another by the main entrance, the third blocking the side exit I'd considered using. Whatever was happening, it had been coordinated with military precision. I approached slowly, confusion warring with alarm. "What's going on?" The pale-eyed man turned to me, and something in his expression softened fractionally, though his eyes never lost their predatory edge. "You shouldn't drink this." His voice was deep, cultured, with a faint accent I couldn't quite place. Russian perhaps, or Ukrainian. "Your companion added something to it while you were gone." The words took a moment to register. Then ice flooded my veins. "What?" Royan had gone chalk-white, sweat now pouring down his face. "I don't know what he's talking about. He's insane. Svetlana, let's just go." "Sit down." The command wasn't loud, but it cut through the lounge like a blade. Royan sat, and I noticed his hands were shaking. "I watched you." The pale-eyed man's attention never left Royan now, and there was something ancient in his gaze, something that made my scientific mind insist this wasn't possible even as I witnessed it. "The moment she walked away, you pulled something from your pocket. Small vial. You poured it into her drink and stirred it with the cocktail spoon. Did you think no one would notice?" My hands were shaking. "Royan, what did you do?" "Nothing." "He's lying. Svetlana, please, you know me." "If it's nothing," the pale-eyed man set my mug down on the table with deliberate care, "then you won't mind proving it. Drink." The entire lounge had gone silent. Every eye was on our table. I noticed things I'd missed before, how still the man's chest was as if he didn't need to breathe. How his skin, despite its healthy color, had a quality that reminded me of preserved specimens in my laboratory. How when he moved, it was with fluid precision that defied normal human biomechanics. "I'm not drinking her mocktail," Royan stammered. "That's ridiculous." "Then I'll call the ship's security." The man pulled out his phone. "Explain to them why you drugged someone's beverage in a crowded establishment with multiple witnesses." His companions moved closer, walls of muscle dressed in formal attire. The one blocking the main entrance crossed his arms, revealing hands that could probably crush bone. Royan looked around desperately, searching for an ally, an escape route. He found neither. "Fine." Royan's voice cracked. "Fine, I'll take a sip. This is insane. There's nothing in it." He reached for the mug with trembling fingers. The pale-eyed man kept his phone ready, his expression carved from stone. Royan lifted the mojito to his lips, and I saw the exact moment he realized he was trapped. His hand shook so badly some of the liquid spilled onto the table. All of it, the man said quietly, and the threat in his tone was unmistakable. If you put it in her drink, you can drink it yourself. Royan looked at me then and I saw fear in his eyes. Genuine animal fear. Svetlana, please. But I said nothing. Some part of me, the part that had endured 3 years of his manipulation, his slow erosion of everything I was, wanted to see this. Needed to see him face consequences for once. Royan drank 3 large swallows that drained half the mug. He set it down with shaking hands, trying to sound defiant. Happy now? We'll see, the pale-eyed man said. He pulled out the chair I'd been sitting in and gestured for me to take it, positioning himself between me and Royan like a barrier. Sit. Stay away from him. I sat, unable to process what was happening. This stranger had just forced my ex-boyfriend to drink a mocktail Royan had apparently drugged meant for me. The reality of how close I'd come to danger crashed over me in waves. Within 3 minutes, Royan started sweating profusely. His pupils dilated until his eyes looked black. He gripped the table like the room was spinning, which it probably was. I don't feel good, he mumbled, his words slurring. What's happening? What did you give her? The man's voice had gone cold, absolutely arctic. What was in that vial? Royan didn't answer. He was too busy fighting whatever was coursing through his system. His head dropped to the table, arms splayed out, fingers twitching. The pale-eyed man made a subtle gesture, and 2 of his companions appeared at Royan's side. They lifted him between them, supporting his weight as his legs buckled. I noticed they moved with the same unnatural fluidity, the same predatory grace. Take him to the medical bay, the man said. Make sure the ship's doctor documents everything. Don't let him leave until we know exactly what he used. They nodded and half-carried, half-dragged Royan toward a service exit I hadn't noticed before. The lounge slowly came back to life around us, conversations resuming, though I caught people staring at me with a mixture of curiosity and pity. The man who had saved me pulled out the chair across from mine and sat down with fluid grace that looked choreographed. Are you all right? Such a simple question. Was I all right? I'd almost been drugged by my ex-boyfriend. A stranger had intervened in a way that suggested he was very familiar with situations like this. My hands wouldn't stop shaking and my scientific mind was cataloging impossibilities. How he'd moved, how he'd commanded the room, how his companions had appeared and disappeared like shadows. I don't know, I said honestly. I don't understand what just happened. Your ex-boyfriend tried to drug you. I stopped him. He said it simply like it was obvious. Then he extended his hand. I'm Rublev Romanov. I shook it automatically. His grip was firm, cool despite the lounge's warmth. Svetlana Mertens. Svetlana. He said my name like he was tasting it, testing how it felt. Were you planning to drink that entire mojito? The question made me nauseous. I was celebrating. I have a research position starting in 2 weeks. I thought. My voice broke slightly. I thought I was finally moving on. Something flickered in Rublev's pale eyes. Not quite sympathy but understanding. You're moving on. You just had a very close call first. A server appeared with a glass of water, which I accepted gratefully. My throat felt tight, my chest constricted with the weight of what could have happened. How did you know? I asked. How did you see him do it? Rublev leaned back slightly, and in the shifting light from the windows, I noticed his pupils didn't adjust to the brightness the way human eyes should. I noticed things. It's how I've survived in my line of work. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I saw you when you first came in. You looked nervous, on edge, trying very hard to convince yourself you were happy. Then he arrived and you looked afraid. I wasn't afraid, I protested weakly. You were. And you tried to hide it, which made me pay closer attention. When you left for the bathroom, I watched him. He gestured to the curved booth where his associates had resumed their business discussion. Old habit. What kind of work requires that kind of attention? The question came out before I could stop it. His expression was unreadable. The kind where noticing details means the difference between living and dying. And the kind where I've learned to recognize men who hurt women. Thank you. The words felt inadequate for what he'd done. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here. Rublev's expression hardened. Yes, you do. That's why you're shaking. He was right. I knew exactly what Royan had planned. Whatever was in that drug, he'd intended for me to be helpless, vulnerable. The thought made bile rise in my throat. You shouldn't be alone tonight, Rublev said, his voice gentle but insistent. Do you have somewhere safe to go? Someone who can stay with you? I thought of my cabin, the one I'd been so proud to afford. A balcony suite with ocean views. Royan knew my cabin number. I'd stupidly mentioned it in one of my final emails when I'd been trying to be civil about the breakup. My cabin, I said. But he might know where it is. Then you're not going back there alone. Rublev pulled out his phone and typed something quickly. I have a suite on the upper deck. You can stay there. No expectations, no strings. Just safety until you figure out your next move. Every warning bell in my head went off. I didn't know this man. He might have saved me, but accepting his offer felt like trading one dangerous situation for another. As if reading my thoughts, Rublev added, Katya, my security chief, will be there. She'll stay in the sitting room while you take the bedroom. I won't even be present. I have business to attend to. He met my eyes directly. I understand your hesitation. But your ex-boyfriend just tried to drug you on a ship in the middle of the Mediterranean. You're not safe alone tonight, and you know it. He was right. I did know it. Royan would come to my cabin. He'd bang on the door, make a scene, maybe force his way in. The thought of facing him alone after what he'd just tried to do terrified me more than accepting help from a stranger. Just for tonight, I whispered. Rublev stood, offering his hand to help me up. Just for tonight. As he guided me through the lounge toward a private elevator I hadn't known existed, I noticed the way people watched us. Not with the curiosity they'd shown during the confrontation, but with something else. Recognition, perhaps. Or fear. And I noticed something else. In the floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the lounge, I could see my own image clearly. But Rublev Romanov cast no reflection at all. The private elevator required a key card, which Rublev produced from inside that anachronistic coat. As the doors slid shut, sealing us in polished chrome and soft lighting, my scientific mind finally caught up to what my instincts had been screaming. No reflection. I'd seen it clearly in those floor-to-ceiling windows. My own image in the silver dress I'd chosen so carefully, the copper mug on the table, the other guests milling about. But where Rublev should have appeared, there was nothing. Just empty space shaped like absence. My breath quickened. The elevator was rising, numbers climbing past the passenger decks toward the exclusive suites at the ship's crown. I was alone in an enclosed space with a man who defied basic physics, being taken to an unknown location, and every rational thought I possessed was screaming that this was how horror stories began. Your heart rate just spiked, Rublev observed without looking at me. What changed? The fact that he could hear my heartbeat without touching me should have been the final warning. Instead, years of scientific training kicked in. When confronted with impossible data, you didn't ignore it. You collected more information. You don't have a reflection, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. In the windows. I saw everyone else, but not you. He turned to face me fully, and I noticed for the first time how completely still he was. No fidgeting, no unconscious shifts of weight, no rise and fall of breathing. He stood like a statue carved from living flesh. Very observant, he said quietly. Most people don't notice for much longer. But then you're a scientist. You're trained to see what others miss. How did you know I'm a scientist? You examined your mocktail before drinking it. Checked the garnish, inhaled the aroma, took an analytical first sip. You've been trained to observe carefully before consuming anything. His pale eyes held mine. And when your ex-boyfriend appeared, your pupils dilated, your breathing changed, but you didn't run. You calculated odds, assessed variables, made a strategic decision to stay where there were witnesses. That's not emotion, that's applied methodology. The elevator doors opened onto a private corridor, plush carpet muffling our footsteps. Only 4 doors lined this hallway, suggesting suites of considerable size. You didn't answer my question, I pressed. About the reflection. I will. But first, let's make sure you're somewhere safe. He stopped at the end door, used another keycard, and gestured for me to enter ahead of him. I hesitated at the threshold. This was the decision point. Cross this line and I was committed to whatever came next. Stay in the corridor and I was vulnerable to Royan, to whatever he'd planned, to dangers I understood all too well. Sometimes the devil you don't know is safer than the one you do. I stepped inside. The suite stole my breath. Floor-to-ceiling windows curved along one entire wall, revealing the Mediterranean stretching to the horizon, moonlight painting silver pathways across dark water. The furnishings were elegant but understated. No cruise ship kitsch, just clean lines and expensive materials. But what caught my attention were the artifacts scattered throughout the space like a museum exhibit. A medieval sword mounted above the fireplace, its blade etched with Cyrillic text. An icon painting that looked genuinely Byzantine, not a reproduction. A collection of antique photographs in silver frames, their subjects dressed in clothing spanning 3 centuries. A samovar that belonged in the Hermitage, not a cruise ship suite. "This isn't standard ship decor," I murmured, drawn to one of the photographs. It showed a group of men in Imperial Russian military uniforms, circa 1900s. One of them had Rublev's exact features. "I prefer to travel with familiar things," Rublev said from behind me, close enough that I should have felt his breath on my neck. I didn't. The suite came furnished, but I've added personal touches. I turned to face him, and the scientific part of my brain that had been frantically trying to rationalize everything suddenly went quiet. Sometimes you reached a point where the data overwhelmed your theoretical framework. Where you had to accept that your understanding of reality was incomplete. "What are you?" I asked, echoing the question I'd been avoiding since that moment in the lounge. Rublev's expression shifted, became something ancient and sad. "I'm what humanity has spent millennia trying to forget. What your folklore remembers but your science denies." He moved to pour himself a drink from a crystal decanter, dark liquid too thick to be wine. "I'm a vampire, Dr. Mertens. And you just became very, very valuable to people you don't want to meet." The word hung in the air between us, absurd and impossible. Vampires were mythology, cultural constructs built around disease and decomposition superstitions. They didn't exist outside literature and film. Except I'd seen him move with inhuman speed. Noticed his lack of breath, his missing reflection, the way his companions had coordinated like apex predators. And when Royan had collapsed just before losing consciousness, he'd said something I'd barely registered in the moment. Royan mentioned the Cursinis, I said slowly, my mind racing through implications. Before he passed out. He said they'd be angry. "Who are the Cursinis?" "Sit down," Rublev said gently. "This will take some explanation." I prefer to stand. My legs felt unsteady, but surrendering that last bit of control felt dangerous. "Then at least move away from the door. If your ex wakes up and comes looking for you, I'd rather you weren't in the immediate line of approach." That made tactical sense. I moved to the windows, putting my back to the moonlit sea and keeping Rublev in my line of sight. From this vantage I could see both the suite's entrance and the man who claimed to be something impossible. "The Cursinis are an old family," Rublev began, swirling the liquid in his glass. "Very old. Italian nobility turned in the 16th century, now operating a network that spans the Mediterranean. They want control of maritime trade routes that my organization currently manages. But territorial disputes between our kind are complicated. We can't simply go to war without drawing attention." He paused. "So we look for leverage. Advantages. And your ex-boyfriend just tried to deliver you to them as both." My laugh came out sharp, slightly hysterical. "This is insane. You're telling me there's vampire organized crime fighting over shipping lanes, and Royan was what? Their errand boy. Your ex-boyfriend is human. For now. The Cursinis promised him transformation in exchange for bringing them something they couldn't obtain themselves." Rublev's pale eyes fixed on me with uncomfortable intensity. "They wanted you, Dr. Mertens. Specifically you. Because your blood has properties that make you extraordinarily rare." "That's impossible. I've had complete blood work done dozens of times. By human doctors looking for human abnormalities. They wouldn't recognize what makes you valuable to us." He set down his glass and moved closer, though he maintained careful distance. "May I ask you something? Have you ever noticed that mosquitoes never bite you? That when you cut yourself the bleeding stops unusually fast? That you've never gotten infections even from wounds that should have been problematic?" I wanted to deny it, but my scientific training wouldn't let me lie about observable data. "Yes. But that's just good genetics, efficient clotting factors. It's your blood actively protecting you. And that same quality that makes it defensive in your body makes it something else entirely to vampires." Rublev's voice dropped lower, became almost hypnotic. "Most human blood sustains us, yes, but it also triggers violent urges. bloodlust that requires tremendous control to manage. But blood like yours, it nourishes without that cost. It's like the difference between cheap alcohol that makes you dangerous and fine wine that just makes you more yourself. The implications crashed over me in waves. So the Cursinis wanted to kidnap me and use me as some kind of blood source? Among other things. Your research on bioluminescent organisms caught their attention 6 months ago. They wondered if someone who understood deep-sea adaptations might also understand vampire biology. His jaw tightened. They sent your ex-boyfriend to get close to you, gather information, eventually bring you to them. Tonight was supposed to be his delivery. I sank into the nearest chair, my legs finally giving out. This couldn't be real. Vampires didn't exist. Royan hadn't spent 3 years with me as part of some supernatural conspiracy. Except it explained so much. His sudden interest in my research after years of dismissing it. The way he tracked my every movement isolated me from colleagues. His desperate need to know where I'd be, when, with whom. I'd thought it was controlling jealousy. It had been reconnaissance. I think I'm going to be sick, I whispered. Rublev was there instantly, that impossible speed again, pressing a cold cloth to my forehead. Breathe, Foley. Your nervous system is trying to reconcile information it wasn't designed to process. Give it time. How much time did it take you? I asked, looking up at him. When you returned. How long before you accepted this was real? Something like respect flickered across his features. Most people don't ask about my experience. They're too focused on their own fear. He sat across from me, carefully, like he was approaching a skittish animal. I had the advantage of being turned during war. I was already familiar with death, with the impossible becoming routine. But it still took weeks before I stopped questioning my sanity. How long ago? The Crimean War. 1854. Over 170 years. I was sitting across from something that had lived through the rise and fall of empires, that had seen the world transform beyond recognition, that had once been human and now was something else entirely. Prove it, I said suddenly. If this is real, if you're what you claim, prove it. Show me something that can't be explained away. Rublev smiled, and this time I saw his canines elongate, becoming pointed fangs that should have been prosthetic but moved with his flesh, real and deadly. His eyes shifted too, the pale color bleeding away until they glowed faintly crimson. Then he moved. One moment he was sitting across from me. The next he was across the suite by the windows. Then behind me, his hand on the back of my chair, never touching me but demonstrating speed that defied physics. Finally he was back in his original position, his features returned to human normal. All in the space of perhaps 3 seconds. Is that sufficient proof? He asked quietly. Or would you like me to demonstrate more? My heart hammered against my ribs. My training said this was impossible. Humans couldn't move that fast, eyes didn't change color through will, bone structure didn't shift. But I'd seen it with my own eyes. Sometimes you had to revise your theoretical framework based on new data. The Cursinis, I managed. What will they do when they realize Royan failed? They'll try again. More carefully next time. Rublev's expression turned grim. Which is why you need protection. Real protection from people who understand what you're facing. Protection from vampires. Provided by a vampire. I laughed, the sound edging toward hysteria again. Do you see the logical problem here? I see a woman who's brilliant enough to recognize when she's out of her depth, and brave enough to ask for help anyway. He leaned forward slightly. I'm offering you sanctuary, Dr. Mertens. For tonight, for however long it takes to ensure your safety. But I need you to understand what that means. My world has rules you don't know, dangers you haven't imagined. If you accept my protection, you're accepting everything that comes with it. The door opened before I could respond. A woman entered, tall, athletic build, blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun. She moved with the same predatory grace as Rublev's other associates, and her eyes swept the suite with professional efficiency before landing on me. This is the one? She asked in Ukrainian accented English. The scientist with the blood? This is Dr. Svetlana Mertens, Rublev corrected. And yes, Katya, she's under my protection now. Make sure the ship's medical staff understands that her ex-boyfriend attempted drugging and is to be held until we determine exactly what substance he used. Katya nodded, but her ice-blue eyes remained fixed on me. She knows what you are? I've told her. She's processing. Processing, I echoed faintly. That's one word for it. Katya crossed the suite and stood before me, radiating the kind of confidence that came from centuries of surviving impossible odds. I was turned in 1709 during the Battle of Poltava. I've spent 300 years protecting fools who didn't listen to warnings. Her voice was hard but not unkind. Don't be one of those fools. When Rublev offers protection, you take it. The alternative is worse than you can imagine. How reassuring, I muttered. She smiled slightly. I'm Ukrainian. We don't do reassurance. We do reality. She glanced at Rublev. The human is secure and medical. I'll post guards to ensure he doesn't leave or communicate with anyone. What else do you need? Make sure Dr. Mertens' cabin is secured. Have her belongings brought here. And find out how the Kursinis knew she'd be on this ship. Someone leaked passenger manifests. Katya nodded and left as efficiently as she'd arrived, the door clicking shut with a finality that made my situation impossible to ignore. I was in a vampire's suite, under the protection of creatures I hadn't believed existed an hour ago, because my ex-boyfriend had tried to drug me on behalf of an immortal crime family. My research on bioluminescent organisms suddenly seemed quaint by comparison. I need you to tell me something honestly, I said to Rublev. Are you keeping me safe or keeping me contained? His expression turned serious. For tonight? Both. You're in shock, you're vulnerable, and the Kursinis now know you're on this ship. Letting you wander around would be dangerous for everyone. He paused. But tomorrow, when you've had time to think clearly, I'll give you a choice. Accept my protection and learn to navigate this world. Or I'll arrange for you to disembark at the next port with resources to disappear. Your autonomy matters to me, Dr. Mertens. Even if your safety matters more. I looked out at the Mediterranean, at the moon painting silver on black water, and wondered if I'd ever see the world the same way again. Somewhere in the deep ocean I'd studied for years, bioluminescent creatures created light in absolute darkness. They'd adapted to pressures that would crush most life. Maybe I could adapt too. I'll stay, I said quietly. At least until I understand what I'm dealing with. Rublev inclined his head, something like relief crossing his features. Then let me start by explaining exactly what your blood means to my kind, and why the Kursinis will never stop hunting you unless we make them. Rublev moved to a cabinet that looked like it belonged in a 19th century apothecary and returned with what I initially thought was a decorative box. When he opened it, I saw medical equipment. A portable microscope, slides, lancets, collection vials. All of it looked modern, expensive, and completely out of place among his antique furnishings. You want proof, he said, setting the box on the coffee table between us. Let's start with evidence you can examine yourself. My scientific training warred with self-preservation instinct. Taking blood samples from a creature that supposedly fed on blood seemed strategically unsound. But curiosity had always been my strongest impulse, stronger even than fear. Your blood first, I said. Then mine for comparison. Something that might have been approval flickered across his features. He rolled up his sleeve without hesitation, revealing a forearm that should have shown veins beneath pale skin but didn't. Using the lancet with casual efficiency that suggested centuries of practice, he drew a small sample and prepared a slide. The microscope is already calibrated, he said, gesturing for me to look. I bent to the eyepiece, adjusted the focus, and froze. The cells I was viewing were wrong. Not in the way diseased cells were wrong, but in a way that suggested they operated under entirely different biological rules. They were crystalline, almost geometric, with structures that refracted light in patterns I'd only seen in certain deep-sea organisms. They didn't flow like normal blood cells. They pulsed, moving with coordinated precision that reminded me of bioluminescent bacteria communicating through chemical signals. This is impossible, I whispered, but I was already reaching for the lancet. I need to see my own sample. Rublev watched as I pricked my finger, noting I'm sure how quickly the bleeding stopped, and prepared my own slide. When I looked through the microscope this time, I saw human erythrocytes, standard leukocytes, normal platelets. But there was something else too. Scattered among the regular cells were others that glowed faintly even under normal light. Cells that shouldn't exist in human blood but looked hauntingly similar to the light-producing photophores I'd studied in deep-sea fish. What am I seeing? I asked, though part of me already knew. Your blood produces a compound similar to what we call daywalker serum, the theoretical substance that could allow vampires to tolerate sunlight. Rublev's voice carried an edge of excitement he was trying to suppress. In 4 centuries I've only encountered 3 humans with this property. 2 of them were claimed by rival factions before I even knew they existed. You're the 3rd. I sat back, my mind racing through implications. This is why the Cursinis wanted me. Not just as a food source but as, what? A renewable resource for some kind of genetic therapy. Essentially, if they could isolate and replicate the compound your blood produces naturally, they could revolutionize vampire existence. Imagine immortal beings who could operate freely during daylight hours, who didn't need to hide from the sun that once gave them life. He paused. Imagine the tactical advantage that would provide in territorial disputes. And your interest in me is different how exactly? The question hung between us, sharp and necessary. Rublev met my gaze directly, and I saw something in his pale eyes that might have been honesty or might have been a very good performance. My interest is in keeping you alive and autonomous while preventing the Cursinis from obtaining something they'd weaponize. He gestured to the microscope. I won't deny that your blood fascinates me on multiple levels. But I've spent centuries building an organization based on consent and sustainability. The Cursinis operate through coercion and exploitation. The difference matters. Before I could respond, someone knocked. 3 sharp raps followed by 2 slower ones, obviously a code. Rublev called permission to enter, and a woman swept in carrying a medical bag that looked far more sophisticated than the portable kit we'd been using. She was striking in that timeless way that suggested either exceptional genetics or supernatural preservation. Dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, olive skin, features that could have been Northern Italian. She wore ship's medical staff uniform, but the way she moved suggested the uniform was costume rather than identity. Dr. Isadora Ferrante, Rublev introduced. Ship's chief medical officer and one of the finest physicians in our community. Isadora, this is Dr. Svetlana Mertens. The bioluminescence specialist, Isadora said, her Italian accent musical. I've read your published papers. Brilliant work on photophore evolution. She set down her bag and pulled out examination equipment. Now let's see what makes you so valuable that the Cursinis risked breaking territorial treaties. The examination was thorough and professional. Isadora checked my vitals, drew multiple blood samples, asked questions about my medical history with the kind of focused attention that made me suspect she was cataloging far more than just standard health markers. Through it all, Rublev watched from near the windows, a shadow against the moonlit sea. You weren't drugged, Isadora finally announced, labeling the last vial of my blood. Whatever your ex-boyfriend put in that mocktail, you didn't ingest enough to affect you. But your blood. She held up one of the vials, watching it catch the light. It's remarkable. The bioluminescent properties are even stronger than the historical accounts suggested. Historical accounts? I asked. You've seen this before? In medical texts from the 17th century. There was a Russian woman, a healer in Siberia, whose blood was said to glow in darkness. The local vampire lord tried to claim her, but she disappeared into the taiga before he could. Isadora's expression turned serious. They found her 3 months later. She'd chosen death by exposure over captivity. The story settled over me like ice water. You're telling me this to warn me? I'm telling you this so you understand what you represent. Power. Advantage. The kind of strategic asset that factions go to war over. She glanced at Rublev. Some would protect that asset carefully. Others would simply consume it. And which type are you? I asked Rublev directly. He turned from the windows, and in the moonlight his features looked carved from marble, ancient and implacable. I'm the type who spent 4 centuries building something sustainable because I remember what it was like to be human. To have choices taken away by something stronger, older, more ruthless. He moved closer but stopped carefully short of invading my space. I noticed you the moment you boarded this ship, Dr. Mertens. Your blood sings in ways I haven't heard in all my existence. It would be easy to justify keeping you, to convince myself that controlling you would be protection. But I watched you in the Eclipse Lounge tonight. Brilliant, brave, trying so hard to convince yourself you were free. I won't be another cage, even a comfortable one. Pretty words, I said, but I was listening to his heartbeat, or rather the absence of it. Vampires might lie, but their bodies apparently didn't maintain the physiological responses humans use to detect deception. I'd have to learn entirely new metrics for truth. Katia entered without knocking, her military bearing somehow making the intrusion seem appropriate. The human is awake and demanding to see Svetlana. The ship's security is asking questions about what happened in the Eclipse Lounge. And I've confirmed surveillance. 3 Corsini operatives are definitely aboard this vessel. Let them ask questions, Rublev said calmly. We have multiple witnesses to an attempted drugging. As for the Corsini operatives, I want them monitored but not confronted. Not yet. And the human's demands? Katia asked. Ignore them. He has no rights here. I stood abruptly, anger cutting through my scientific fascination. His name is Royan. And regardless of what he tried to do, he's still entitled to. To what? Katia interrupted, her ice blue eyes hard. He tried to drug you for an immortal crime family. In human courts, that's attempted kidnapping at minimum. In our world, it's an act of war. The only reason he's still alive is because Rublev finds human casualties distasteful. She's right, Rublev said quietly. Your ex-boyfriend made choices that removed him from normal human protections. He's a pawn who thought he was becoming a player. The Corsinis would have transformed him, yes, long enough to use him to access you, then disposed of him when he was no longer useful. You don't know that. I know exactly that. I've seen this strategy employed for 2 centuries. His voice carried the weight of experience I couldn't counter. The Corsinis promised him immortality, power, revenge for whatever perceived slight made him hate you enough to betray you. But transformation requires resources they wouldn't waste on someone with no long-term value. Isadora finished packing her medical equipment but paused at the door. The blood analysis will take several hours. I'll have results by morning. She looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. Get some rest, Dr. Mertens. Tomorrow you'll need to make decisions about your future. Those decisions are easier when you're not running on adrenaline and shock. After she left, Katia positioned herself near the door with the clear intention of remaining there. I'll maintain watch outside. No one approaches this suite without clearance. Which left me alone with Rublev in a space that suddenly felt much smaller despite its size. You should sleep, he said, gesturing toward what I assumed was the bedroom. I have work to do, coordinating security, reviewing ship manifests, ensuring the Corsinis don't make another attempt tonight. Where will you be? The question came out more vulnerable than I intended. Right here. I don't sleep the way humans do. I enter a meditative state for a few hours before dawn, but I remain aware of my surroundings. He must have seen my expression because he added, I won't enter the bedroom. You'll have complete privacy. But I'll be close enough to respond if anything happens. I wanted to argue, to insist I could take care of myself, to reject this entire impossible situation. Instead, I heard myself asking, why did Royan call me Megan earlier? When you confronted him, he said, I don't know what he's talking about. Megan, let's just go. But that's not my name. Rublev's expression darkened. Because he wasn't seeing you. He was following a script, playing a role. The Corsinis told him what to say, how to manipulate you, probably fed him lies about how you'd be treated. They didn't care enough to make sure he had your name right. He paused. That's what you were to him, Dr. Mertens. A mission objective. Not a person. The words hurt more than they should have, confirming what part of me had always suspected, that Royan had never truly seen me at all. I retreated to the bedroom without another word, closing the door with deliberate care. The space was as elegantly appointed as the rest of the suite, dominated by a bed that looked like it could sleep 4 people comfortably. My laptop and overnight bag had been delivered, Katia's efficiency no doubt, and arranged neatly on the dresser. I changed into sleep clothes mechanically, my mind still processing everything I'd learned. Vampires were real. My blood was valuable. I'd spent 3 years with a man who'd been preparing to sell me to immortal criminals. And I was now under the protection of a creature who'd lived through the fall of empires and claimed to respect my autonomy. I should have been terrified. Instead, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I felt my scientific curiosity igniting in ways it hadn't since before Royan had started diminishing every insight I shared. Questions cascaded through my mind. How did vampire metabolism actually work? What was the evolutionary origin of their species? Could the bioluminescent properties in my blood be artificially replicated? What were the biochemical mechanisms that made them vulnerable to sunlight? For the first time in 3 years, I wanted to know everything. Through the closed door, I heard Rublev moving with that preternatural quiet, the sound of papers being shuffled. A phone conversation conducted in Russian too rapid for me to follow with my basic language skills. He was coordinating something complex, managing threats I was only beginning to understand. And he was keeping watch over me, this ancient predator who claimed to value consent in a world built on predation. I didn't trust him. I'd be a fool to trust anyone in this situation. But I was alive, I was thinking clearly for the first time in years. And tomorrow I'd have access to vampire physiology data that no human scientist had ever studied. Sometimes you had to revise your understanding of danger when something even more dangerous was hunting you. I fell asleep cataloging questions, my mind already designing experiments, and dreamed of creatures that created light in absolute darkness, surviving, thriving in pressures that would destroy anything less adapted to the deep. By the third morning I could identify vampires by the way they didn't quite synchronize with the ship's rhythm. Humans swayed slightly with the Mediterranean swells, made unconscious adjustments to maintain balance. Vampires stood like they were rooted to bedrock beneath the ocean floor, their bodies rejecting the physics of a moving vessel. The cruise ship's lecture hall was nearly full when I arrived to set up for my presentation. The Azure Tranquility catered to wealthy intellectuals, and the ship's science symposium had attracted genuine researchers along with curious amateurs. I'd been preparing this talk on bioluminescent communication for months, back when my biggest concern was whether the audience would find deep-sea biology compelling. Now I was scanning faces for signs of predation, wondering which attendees were human and which were immortal operatives monitoring a strategic asset. "You're looking for threats," Katya murmured from beside me. She'd appointed herself my shadow, appearing whenever I left Rublev's suite with the inevitability of sunrise. "Good. You're learning. I count at least 3 vampires in the audience already," I said quietly, adjusting my laptop connection to the projection system. 2 near the exits, 1 in the front row taking notes on actual paper. 4. You missed the one posing as audiovisual crew. Katya nodded toward a young man adjusting cameras with movements too economical to be human. "He's Nikolai, Rublev's technology specialist. Here to ensure no one tries anything during your presentation." "Does Rublev think the Kursinis would attack me in front of 50 witnesses? The Kursinis think they own the Mediterranean. They'd sink this entire ship if they believed they could claim you from the wreckage." She paused, something almost like warmth entering her voice. "Your presentation begins in 5 minutes. Stop thinking about vampire politics and remember why you became a scientist." He was right. I pulled up my slides, high-resolution images of anglerfish, bioluminescent jellyfish, the alien beauty of creatures that created light in the deepest darkness. This was mine. Whatever else was happening, whatever impossible danger I'd stumbled into, this knowledge belonged to me. The lecture hall lights dimmed. I took a breath and began. Bioluminescence represents communication in complete darkness, survival through visibility. We think of the deep ocean as empty, lifeless, but it's actually filled with conversation. Light signals for mating, for hunting, for warning predators away. These organisms don't hide from the darkness. They weaponize it, they beautify it, they transform it into advantage. I spoke for 40 minutes about photophores and luciferin reactions, about evolutionary adaptation and biochemical innovation. The audience was engaged, asking intelligent questions about chemical pathways and ecological roles. And through it all, I was aware of one presence in the back row. Rublev had entered silently after the lights dimmed, taking a seat where he could observe both me and every entrance. He watched with an intensity that should have been unnerving but instead felt like validation. Someone finally seeing my work, understanding its significance. During the Q&A session our eyes met. He didn't smile, didn't react visibly, but something shifted in the space between us. Recognition, perhaps. 2 isolated intelligences acknowledging each other across an impossible divide. A woman in the 3rd row asked about practical applications for bioluminescent research. As I answered, discussing everything from medical imaging to sustainable lighting, I noticed Rublev lean forward slightly, his attention sharpening. After the presentation, attendees clustered around with follow-up questions. I was explaining photophore evolution to a retired chemistry professor when I felt Rublev approach, his presence registering before I saw him. "Dr. Mertens," he said formally, as though we were strangers meeting at an academic conference rather than a scientist under protection of the vampire who'd saved her life. "Fascinating work. Have you considered how bioluminescent communication might apply to species that operate primarily in darkness? The subtext was clear. He was talking about vampire society, about systems of control and hierarchy in the absence of traditional human structures. But the chemistry professor didn't catch it, nodding enthusiastically about cave-dwelling organisms while I tried to formulate a response that worked on both levels. Communication in darkness requires trust that your signal will be correctly interpreted, I said carefully. Bioluminescent organisms have evolved specific wavelengths, specific patterns. Predators learn to recognize and exploit those patterns. So survival depends on constant adaptation, never becoming too predictable. Rublev's expression revealed nothing, but I saw approval in his eyes. A useful lesson for any species. The next 3 days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Mornings I spent in the ship's research library, diving into maritime history and finding oblique references to vampire activity hidden in footnotes about unexplained disappearances and ships that vanished without trace. Afternoons belonged to Katya, who trained me with the grim efficiency of someone who'd survived 3 centuries of warfare. Vampires can influence minds, she explained during our second session in the ship's empty gymnasium. Especially young ones newly turned who haven't learned subtlety. You need to recognize when someone's trying to push thoughts into your head. She demonstrated by attempting minor compulsions, making me want to sit down to look away to forget what we'd discussed. Each time I learned to recognize the intrusion as foreign, a pressure that felt like someone else's while trying to overlay my own. Good, she said after I successfully resisted her 5th attempt. You're naturally resistant, probably related to your unique blood chemistry. But natural resistance isn't enough. You need active awareness. She also taught me to fight. Not elegant martial arts but brutal efficiency, eyes, throat, joints. You'll never overpower a vampire through strength, she said, blocking my strike effortlessly. But you can buy yourself 3 seconds. 3 seconds to run, to call for help, to position yourself near sunlight or weapons. 3 seconds is the difference between capture and escape. The physical training left me bruised but sharper. My body remembered skills I hadn't known I possessed, adaptations that came from years of diving in dangerous waters, of working in environments where one mistake could be fatal. On the 4th evening, Nikolai intercepted me outside Rublev's suite. He was young-looking, perhaps 25 when he'd been turned, with the lean build and nervous energy of someone who died during the Soviet era and never quite adjusted to capitalism. We have a problem, he said in Russian-accented English, pulling up surveillance footage on his tablet. Your ex-boyfriend was moved to a private medical facility yesterday. This morning, the facility reported he'd died of complications from the drugs in his system. My stomach dropped. Died? How? Except he didn't die. Nikolai swiped to another video, this one showing a morgue hallway. He walked out of the morgue 3 hours ago. The Kursinis turned him. Now he's a newborn vampire with an obsessive fixation on you and none of the centuries of control that make older vampires manageable. The implications crashed over me. Royan, who'd spent 3 years trying to control every aspect of my existence, now had supernatural power to enforce that control. Royan, who'd demonstrated increasingly unstable behavior, now had strength and speed that made him lethal. Where is he now? I asked. Still on the ship. We're tracking him through thermal cameras. Newborns run hot, haven't learned to regulate their body temperature yet. But Svetlana. Nikolai's expression turned grim. He's hunting you. The Kursinis are using him as a bloodhound. They've told him you're in danger, that Rublev has brainwashed you, that he needs to rescue you. He believes it absolutely. Of course he does, I said bitterly. Royan always believed his controlling behavior was protection. That night I worked in the ship's laboratory, a well-equipped space that served both the science symposium and wealthy passengers who wanted to pretend at research. I was examining my own blood samples under UV light, documenting the photophore-like structures Isadora had identified, when I noticed something odd in the camera feed reflected on my computer screen. The lab's security camera showed my position clearly, but there was a distortion near the door, not visible to the naked eye, but obvious under the UV spectrum I was using. Someone or something was bending light around themselves, creating camouflage that worked in visible wavelengths but failed under ultraviolet. My heart rate spiked, but I kept my movements casual, continuing to examine slides while my mind raced through options. I was alone in the lab. Katya was outside, but the door was reinforced steel. By the time she broke through, whatever was about to happen would be finished. The distortion moved closer. I could smell something now, a scent like old wine and older stone. Vampire. One that had learned to mask its presence from human awareness. I pretended to drop a slide, bending down to retrieve it while my hand found the UV photography equipment I'd set up earlier. In one motion I stood and triggered the flash. Ultraviolet light designed to photograph bioluminescent specimens but repurposed now as weapon. The vampire materialized, shrieking, their camouflage shattered by UV exposure. They lunged at me with impossible speed, but I'd already thrown myself sideways, knocking over a tray of acid samples that I'd been using to test cell membrane permeability. The door exploded inward. Rublev moved like violence incarnate, intercepting the Corsini operative mid-lunge and slamming them against the laboratory wall with force that cracked the reinforced panels. Katya was there instantly, her movements coordinated with Rublev's through what must have been centuries of fighting together. The combat lasted perhaps 15 seconds. The Corsini vampire fought with desperate strength, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. Katya had them pinned when the vampire made one last lunge toward me, directly through where I'd spilled the acid samples. Their skin began to smoke on contact, flesh dissolving with the kind of chemical efficiency that should have been impossible for undead tissue. They screamed, and the sound was so agonizingly human that my scientific detachment shattered. I'd killed them. Not intentionally, not with malice, but the acid I'd positioned, the trap I'd inadvertently set, it had caused this death. The vampire's body decomposed with unnatural speed, reducing to ash and residue that looked more like ancient decay than recent death. Within minutes, there was nothing left but staining on the laboratory floor and the smell of corruption. I stood there shaking, my hands still clutching the UV equipment, while Rublev secured the laboratory and Katya checked for additional threats. "Are you hurt?" Rublev asked, suddenly in front of me though I hadn't seen him move. His hands were gentle as they tilted my face toward the light, checking for injuries with professional efficiency that suggested centuries of battlefield medicine. "I killed them," I whispered. "I didn't mean to, but You defended yourself. Against an opponent who would have taken you to people who'd treat you as property." His pale eyes held mine. "I need to know, does it get easier? Killing in self-defense." He was quiet for a long moment. "No. And you should be grateful for that. The moment killing becomes easy is the moment you've lost something essential." His thumb brushed across my cheekbone, wiping away a tear I hadn't realized had fallen. "Come. We need to leave this space before more arrive." But I couldn't move, couldn't process what I'd done. My scientific training had prepared me to observe death, to study it objectively. Not to cause it. Not to watch someone dissolve because of my actions. Rublev made a decision. He lifted me effortlessly, that impossible vampire strength, and carried me from the laboratory while Katya remained to manage the scene. I should have protested, insisted I could walk, maintain the independence I'd fought so hard to reclaim. Instead, I buried my face against his shoulder and let myself be carried. We didn't return to his suite. Instead, he took me to the ship's observation deck, a space that jutted out over the bow with floor-to-ceiling windows revealing nothing but moonlit Mediterranean. It was deserted at this hour, isolated from the passenger areas. He set me down carefully on one of the benches, then sat beside me, close enough for comfort, far enough to maintain boundaries. "Tell me about your research," he said quietly. "Tell me why you chose bioluminescence." The request was so unexpected that I laughed, a sound edging toward hysteria. "You want to discuss my career choices after I just killed someone? I want to remind you who you are. Not a killer. A scientist who studies how life survives in impossible conditions." His voice was patient, ancient. "So tell me." I took a shaking breath. I was diving off the Mariana Trench during my graduate work. 20,000 feet down, pressure that should crush anything organic. And there was this jellyfish completely alone in absolute darkness, creating its own light. Not for communication, there was no one to communicate with. Just existing. Being beautiful for no reason except that beauty was how it survived. I wiped at my eyes. I wanted to understand that. How something could be alone and still create light. Rublev was quiet, and when I looked at him, his expression had softened into something vulnerable. I was wounded during the siege of Sevastopol, he said finally. Left for dead in a trench while my unit retreated. A vampire found me, Père Laurent, one of the ancient ones. He could have fed and left me to die. Instead he offered a choice: death as a human or continued existence as something else. His pale eyes reflected moonlight. I chose existence because I wasn't finished learning. 2 centuries of life and I still wanted to know how the world worked. And now, after 400 years, now I've learned that the rarest thing isn't knowledge. It's finding someone else who understands why knowledge matters. He turned to face me fully. You're brilliant, Svetlana. Genuinely, extraordinarily brilliant. And for 3 years, someone tried to make you believe that was a flaw to manage rather than a gift to celebrate. The words shouldn't have meant so much. But after years of making myself smaller, dimming my insights to avoid threatening Royan's ego, hearing validation from someone who'd seen centuries of human achievement felt like permission to exist fully. I need to taste your blood, Rublev said abruptly. Not to feed, I have adequate sources. But to understand. The properties Isadora identified, the bioluminescent compounds. I need to know what you are, what you could become if transformed. Every instinct screamed warning. Letting a vampire feed from you was intimacy, vulnerability, the kind of boundary crossing I'd sworn to avoid. But I was also a scientist, and the question he was asking, what were the full properties of my blood, fascinated me as much as it terrified me. If I agree, I said slowly, I want full documentation. Blood samples before and after, monitoring of physiological responses, data I can analyze. This isn't feeding. It's research. Something like respect and hunger mixed in his expression. Agreed. But Svetlana, this will be intimate regardless of our intentions. Blood exchange between vampires and humans with your properties creates effects. You should understand that before you consent. What kind of effects? Heightened senses. Furia. A temporary connection to the vampire's consciousness. And potentially for you, it might activate latent properties in your blood that we haven't yet observed. He met my eyes directly. It could be dangerous. It will definitely be addictive. I should have refused. Should have maintained professional boundaries, insisted on more conventional analysis. But part of me, the part that had dived into the Mariana Trench alone, that had studied organisms no human had ever seen, needed to know what I was capable of becoming. Do it, I said. But here, no. With parameters I control. Rublev's expression shifted into something ancient and hungry, but when he moved closer, his hands were gentle. Your wrist, he said. It's less intimate than the throat, easier to control the volume. And Svetlana, if you want me to stop at any point, just say so. I've spent 4 centuries learning restraint. I extended my wrist. He cradled it in both hands with unexpected reverence, his thumb tracing over my pulse point. Then he bit down. The pain was sharp and immediate, but it transformed almost instantly into something else. A sensation that raced through my nervous system like electricity, like recognition, like coming home to something I hadn't known I'd been missing. I felt his consciousness brush against mine, ancient and vast, carrying memories of empires and wars and centuries of solitude. And I felt him taste me, not just my blood but my experiences, my knowledge, every dive into deep ocean darkness, every moment of discovery. The sensation was overwhelming, far too intimate, and absolutely intoxicating. When he pulled back, his eyes glowed faintly crimson. I can taste the ocean in you. Every dive, every discovery. You're magnificent. But I barely heard him. My senses had exploded outward. I could hear conversations from the passenger deck above us, could smell the specific chemistry of the Mediterranean, could see colors in the moonlight that shouldn't exist in visible spectrum. And I could feel something activating in my blood, my own bioluminescent cells responding to whatever compound existed in vampire saliva. What did you do to me? I gasped, but it wasn't accusation. It was wonder. I showed you what you could become. His voice was rough, unsteady. If you chose transformation, if you became what I am, you'd be unprecedented. A vampire with your gifts would revolutionize everything we understand about our species. The euphoria was fading, but the heightened senses remained. I looked at my wrist, at the 2 neat puncture marks that were already healing faster than normal. The skin around them glowed faintly in the darkness, my own cells producing light in response to stimulation. I need to document this, I said, pulling out my phone to photograph the phenomenon. This is remarkable. The luciferin response to vampire enzymes, the way my photophores are reacting to. Rublev laughed, and the sound was surprised and genuine. You just had an experience most humans find transformative or traumatic, and you're taking research notes. I'm a scientist. This is what I do. But I was smiling too, feeling more like myself than I had in years. The moment shattered when Katya appeared at the observation deck entrance, her expression grim. We have a problem. Royan is demanding to see Svetlana. He's in the main corridor outside your suite with 3 Corsini operatives, threatening to make a scene if she doesn't come out. The euphoria drained away instantly. My newborn vampire ex-boyfriend, backed by an ancient crime family, was at Rublev's door. And I was standing here with fresh bite marks on my wrist, my blood still singing with vampire compounds, my senses heightened to supernatural levels. What do we do? I asked. Rublev's expression had gone cold, calculating. We remind the Corsinis that some territories aren't negotiable. And we show your ex-boyfriend exactly what he's become, and what he's lost. He offered me his hand. I took it, feeling the coolness of his skin against my still feverish blood. Together, we walked toward a confrontation I wasn't ready for but couldn't avoid. Behind us, the Mediterranean stretched to darkness, and somewhere in those depths, bioluminescent creatures continued their conversations in light, surviving in conditions that would destroy anything less adapted to the pressure. I understood finally why I'd chosen to study them. Royan waited outside Rublev's suite like a nightmare given form. 3 days of transformation had changed him in ways that went beyond the physical. His posture was different, predatory where it had once been calculated, his movements too fluid for the awkward man I'd spent 3 years with. But his eyes were the same, that particular intensity that had always preceded his most controlling behavior, now amplified by newborn vampire hunger. Svetlana. He took a step forward and both Rublev and Katya moved to intercept. Please. I need to talk to you. Just 5 minutes without these people manipulating you. These people saved my life from what you tried to do to me. My voice was steadier than I felt, the residual euphoria from Rublev's feeding giving me clarity I wouldn't normally have. You drugged my drink, Royan. You were going to hand me over to the Corsinis like property. They lied to me. His voice cracked, desperate. They said you were in danger, that you'd been targeted by Rublev's organization, that bringing you to them was protection. I was trying to save you, Lana. Everything I've done has been to save you. The nickname, one I'd always hated but never had the courage to correct, graded like sandpaper. Don't call me that. And you weren't saving me. You were following orders from vampires who promised you immortality in exchange for delivering a strategic asset. Because I love you. The words echoed down the corridor, raw and unhinged. Because I couldn't watch you leave, couldn't accept that you'd throw away 3 years without even trying to fix what we had. The Corsinis offered me a way to be worthy of you, to be strong enough, powerful enough that you'd finally see me. I saw you perfectly clearly, I said, and years of suppressed truth came pouring out. I saw someone who made me smaller so he could feel larger. Who dismissed my research as hobby science, while expecting me to celebrate his adjunct teaching position. Who tracked my location, monitored my emails, and got angry when I had dinner with colleagues without telling him first. You never loved me, Royan. You loved a woman too scared to leave. His face contorted, grief and rage mixing into something inhuman. That's him talking. Rublev has gotten into your head, made you believe. I believe my own experiences. 3 years of slowly losing myself to your insecurity. And now you've been transformed into something that makes your controlling behavior supernatural rather than just pathological. I stepped forward, ignoring Katya's warning hand on my arm. Go back to the Corsinis. Tell them I'm not interested in being rescued by the people who tried to kidnap me. I won't leave you with him. Royan's eyes flashed red, newborn instability making his control slip. If you won't come willingly, the Corsinis will take you. They have resources you can't imagine. Connections that make Rublev's empire look provincial. They'll what? Rublev's voice was soft, deadly. Make threats in my territory? Challenge my claim to someone under my explicit protection? Tell me, newborn, do you understand what you're doing right now? The ancient laws you're violating with every word. Royan's 3 Corsini escorts shifted position, forming a barrier between him and Rublev. One of them, a woman with the kind of ageless beauty that suggested centuries of existence, spoke in Italian accented English. We invoke the right of challenge. The Mertens woman's blood makes her a strategic resource. Your claim to her is recent, opportunistic. Our interest is documented across months of careful planning. Planning that involved drugging and kidnapping, Katya said flatly. Not exactly legal under human or vampire law. Human law doesn't apply to resources with supernatural significance. The Corsini woman's smile was cold. And vampire law is clear. Disputed strategic assets can be claimed through formal challenge. We've already filed notice with the neutral covens. The blood moon rises in 3 days. That's when we'll settle this. The words landed like physical blows. Blood moon. I'd heard Rublev and Katya mention the term, but never explained its full significance. From their expressions it was nothing good. You can't challenge for a person, I said, forcing my way into the conversation. I'm not property to be won or lost based on vampire traditions I never agreed to follow. The Corsini woman looked at me with something between pity and contempt. You became property the moment you were born with blood that could revolutionize our species. Whether you acknowledge that reality is irrelevant. In 3 days, Rublev either surrenders you to Corsini protection, or he fights to permanent death defending his claim. Those are the only options the ancient laws permit. They left then, Royan casting one last desperate look in my direction before his escorts ushered him away. The corridor fell silent except for the distant sound of the ship's engines and my own racing heartbeat. What is a blood moon challenge? I asked once we were back inside the suite. Rublev poured himself a drink, that same thick dark liquid I'd learned was synthetic blood mixed with wine, and drained it before answering. It's how vampires settle territorial disputes that can't be resolved through negotiation. During the blood moon, ancient laws supersede modern conventions. 2 parties fight until one yields or dies permanently. Neutral covens witness to ensure the rules are honored. He met my eyes. And the Corsinis are right, you're legally considered a strategic resource because of your blood properties. Under ancient law, I either prove I can protect what's mine through combat, or I surrender you to whoever defeats me. So I'm property. The words tasted like ash. Despite everything you said about respecting my autonomy, about consent and partnership, I'm just another asset to be claimed. No. He crossed to me, his hands framing my face with desperate gentleness. You're a person who became trapped in systems created millennia before you were born. I don't think of you as property, Svetlana. But the Corsinis invoked ancient laws specifically because they knew it would force this confrontation. His jaw tightened. There's another option. You come with me to my fortress in Crimea. It's protected by wards that predate Christianity, guarded by vampires who've sworn blood oaths to me. The Corsinis can't reach you there and eventually they'll move on to other targets. You want me to hide. My voice was flat. To abandon my research, my career, everything I've fought to reclaim, and live in some castle waiting for immortal criminals to forget about me. I want you alive and safe even if that means you hate me for it. I just got my life back. The words came out sharper than intended, years of frustration compressed into one declaration. I spent 3 years making myself smaller for Royan, changing my ambitions to fit his insecurities. I finally escaped, finally started thinking again, and now you want me to trade research vessels for fortress walls? To become another thing you protect and control. This isn't control. It feels identical from where I'm standing. I pulled away from him, needing distance to think. Every man in my life has tried to keep me safe by limiting what I can do, where I can go, who I can be. Royan did it through emotional manipulation. You do it through supernatural protection. The result is the same, I lose myself either way. Rublev was silent for a long moment, and I watched something shift in his expression. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of centuries. What do you want to do? I want to stay. I want to finish this cruise, attend the remaining symposium sessions, complete the research I came here to do. I met his eyes directly. And I want to face the Corsinis at this Blood Moon challenge. Not as your property, but as a participant who has a stake in the outcome. They'll kill you. The moment you step into a challenge arena without supernatural protection, you're vulnerable to any vampire who wants to claim you through force. Then teach me to protect myself. You have 3 days. Use them to show me how to survive in your world rather than just hide from it. My mind was already racing through possibilities, through the scientific knowledge I'd spent years accumulating. And let me contribute. I'm a biochemist who specializes in organisms that survive impossible conditions. Maybe I can develop weapons that work against vampires, level the playing field in ways you haven't considered. Katya, who'd been silent through this entire exchange, made a sound that might have been approval. She has courage. Foolish courage, but courage nonetheless. And she's right. Waiting in a fortress just delays the inevitable. Better to face it now on terms we choose. Rublev looked between us, clearly torn between protective instinct and respect for my autonomy. Finally he nodded. We do this your way. But Svetlana, if at any point you want to leave to accept sanctuary instead of fighting, you tell me. Your safety matters more than pride or principle. Agreed. Now tell me everything about Blood Moon challenges. Rules, participants, what weapons are permitted. We spent the next hours reviewing vampire law, ancient traditions, the complex politics of neutral coven witnessing. I took notes like I was studying for a dissertation defense, cataloging information that would have seemed insane a week ago but now felt merely urgent. The next morning, I received word that my laboratory had been broken into during the night. All my blood samples, the documentation of bioluminescent properties, the cultures I'd been growing, the genetic analysis Isadora had been conducting were gone. The Cursinis had stolen 3 weeks of work, probably attempting to synthesize my blood properties before the challenge. I should have been devastated. Instead, I felt something cold and calculated settle into place. They'd taken my research. Now I'd take something from them. I spent 2 days in the ship's laboratory with Katya standing guard, developing compounds that weaponized the same bioluminescent properties that made me valuable. Luciferin derivatives mixed with silver particles, suspended in solutions that would be harmless to humans but toxic to vampires. UV-activated compounds that would cause cellular decomposition in undead tissue. Airborne irritants that targeted the heightened sensory capabilities vampires relied on. You're making yourself into a weapon, Katya observed, watching me carefully measure chemicals with the precision of someone who knew exactly how dangerous they were. What happens after? When you've poisoned your own blood, made yourself too dangerous to approach. What kind of life is that? Every organism I've studied survives by being dangerous, I said, not looking up from my work. Anglerfish with bioluminescent lures that hide rows of teeth. Jellyfish that paralyze with a touch. Even the most beautiful deep-sea creatures carry toxins that can kill. That's not corruption, that's adaptation. I finally met her eyes. The Cursinis want me because my blood is valuable. Let's see how valuable I am when that same blood becomes fatal to anyone who takes it without permission. Rublev won't like this. Rublev doesn't get to decide what I do with my own biology. That night I began the process of poisoning myself. Small doses of my own compounds, carefully calculated to saturate my bloodstream without causing permanent damage to my human physiology. The process was agonizing. My enhanced cells reacted to the foreign chemicals, trying to purge them while I forced them to integrate. I vomited twice, ran a fever that had Isadora threatening to sedate me, and spent hours shaking with something that felt like withdrawal. But it worked. By the second evening, my blood glowed faintly in darkness, not with the natural bioluminescence I'd been born with, but with weaponized toxins that would make me poison to any vampire who tried to feed. Rublev found me on the observation deck, watching the Mediterranean turn silver under the rising moon. He stood beside me in silence for several minutes before speaking. I can smell what you've done to yourself. The compounds you've introduced to your blood. His voice was quiet, almost sad. You've made yourself untouchable. I've made myself dangerous. There's a difference. Is there? He turned to face me fully. Svetlana, I need to tell you something. In 4 centuries I've never felt vulnerable. I've built empires, survived wars, outlasted enemies who thought themselves invincible. But you terrify me. His pale eyes held mine with painful honesty. Because I'm falling in love with you and I don't know how to protect someone who refuses to be protected. The confession hung between us, raw and complicated by everything we'd been through. I should have been touched, should have felt validation in being loved by someone who'd seen centuries of human existence. Instead, I felt the weight of another person's emotions trying to dictate my choices. I don't need you to protect me, I said gently. I need you to respect that I can protect myself even if the methods make you uncomfortable. And I need you to understand that loving me means accepting that I make my own choices about danger. Even choices that could kill you. Especially those. Because the alternative, living in safety but losing myself, that's already killed me once. I won't let it happen again. He was quiet for a long time and I watched the moon continue its rise, watched the Mediterranean waters reflect light that had traveled from a dead star. Finally Rublev spoke again, his voice rough with emotion he rarely showed. Then I won't protect you from the world. I'll teach you to survive it. Starting now. He spent the remaining day before the blood moon teaching me vampire combat. Not the defensive moves Katya had drilled, but offensive techniques that exploited vampire weaknesses. How to use their speed against them, forcing them into sunlight or confined spaces. How to recognize when an older vampire was controlling a younger one, breaking concentration to shatter compulsion. How to move unpredictably, making it impossible for supernatural reflexes to anticipate human chaos. And in the quiet hours between training, our relationship shifted into something more physical. The feeding had broken a barrier between us, created a connection that was part supernatural, part intensely human. I craved his bite with an intensity that should have alarmed me, craved the euphoria and the temporary merging of consciousness that came with blood exchange. This is addiction, I told him after the third feeding, my skin still glowing faintly from the compounds reacting with vampire enzymes. You know that, right? The biological mechanisms are identical to drug dependency. I know. His hand traced patterns on my skin following the bioluminescent trails. I can feel you craving it, smell the chemical changes in your body when I'm near. If you want me to stop, to maintain distance until the challenge is over. I don't want you to stop. The admission was difficult, acknowledging that I was choosing this addiction consciously. I just need to understand it. To know where the supernatural compulsion ends and my own desire begins. They're intertwined now. The moment I tasted your blood, we created a connection that doesn't fully separate. He met my eyes. But Svetlana, if you ever feel controlled, if this becomes something you're doing because I want it rather than because you do, you tell me. Immediately. I will. And I meant it, even as I tilted my head to expose my throat, offering access I'd never granted anyone. The feeding was overwhelming as always. That sensation of boundaries dissolving, of experiencing 4 centuries of existence compressed into moments of intimacy. But this time I also felt his fear, his terrible certainty that the challenge would take me from him, that all his power and experience wouldn't be enough to keep me safe. When he pulled back, I was crying and didn't know why. I'm sorry, I whispered. I'm sorry you have to feel afraid because of me. Don't apologize for making me human again, he said, his lips still stained with my blood. It's the greatest gift you could give. The next evening, Père Laurent arrived. The ancient vampire who'd turned Rublev during the Crimean War. He was impossibly old, his presence carrying weight that made even Rublev seem young by comparison. He greeted me with grave courtesy, his French-accented English formal and precise. Dr. Mertens, I'm here as neutral witness to ensure the Blood Moon Challenge is conducted honorably. His dark eyes assessed me with uncomfortable accuracy. You should know, Rublev has never invoked protection rights for a human before. In 4 centuries he's claimed territory, resources, strategic advantages. But never a person. Whatever you are to him, it's unprecedented. I'm a scientist who got caught in supernatural politics I didn't ask for, I said. You're more than that. You're the reason an ancient vampire is risking permanent death rather than negotiating territorial concessions. He paused. The Cursinis have issued their formal terms. Tomorrow night, during the blood moon, Rublev and their champion, Vincenzo Corsini himself, fight to surrender or true death. The victor claims Mediterranean maritime routes and custody of you. Those are the stakes. And if I refuse to be claimed by anyone? Père Laurent's expression was almost sympathetic. Then both sides will hunt you until one succeeds. Ancient law doesn't recognize your autonomy in this matter. Only which vampire faction proves strong enough to hold what they claim. I looked at Rublev, saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and released. He'd kill for me tomorrow. And I'd poisoned my own blood, weaponized my biology, learned to fight against creatures who could tear humans apart. We were both trying to survive impossible pressure. adapting in ways that might destroy the people we'd been. Then let's make sure tomorrow night, everyone understands I'm not anyone's prize, I said quietly. I'm a participant, not a reward. And I'm far more dangerous than they realize. The moon rose outside, swollen and red, the blood moon that gave the challenge its name. In 24 hours, everything would be decided. I spent my last evening before the challenge in Rublev's suite, memorizing the feeling of his presence, the way he moved through space with predatory grace, the sound of his voice when he wasn't performing authority for subordinates. We didn't speak much. Words felt inadequate for what was coming. As dawn approached, I felt him begin to slip into the meditative state that passed for vampire sleep. His arms remained around me, protective even in unconsciousness. I lay there thinking about bioluminescent creatures in the deep ocean, about how they survived crushing pressure by becoming light itself, by turning their greatest vulnerability into their brightest advantage. Tomorrow I would do the same. Either I'd emerge from this challenge transformed, empowered, finally free. Or I'd be crushed by forces I couldn't overcome. But I wouldn't be anyone's possession. Not Royan's, not the Corsini's, not even Rublev's, despite the love I was beginning to feel for him. I'd be dangerous, brilliant, mine. The way I was always meant to be. The ship's upper deck had been cleared of passengers, cordoned off with security tape that wouldn't stop anyone truly determined but served as symbolic boundary. Midnight approached, and the blood moon hung swollen and crimson over the Mediterranean, turning the water below into something that looked like spilled wine. Representatives from 8 major covens had arrived throughout the evening. Vampires so ancient they moved like living history, carrying the weight of centuries in their deliberate gestures. They positioned themselves around the deck's perimeter, neutral witnesses to whatever would unfold. Père Laurent stood at the center, his dark eyes reflecting moonlight as he prepared to officiate. I stood beside Rublev, wearing clothing Katia had selected, flexible, dark, with hidden pockets containing vials of my weaponized compounds. The UV drones I'd built with the ship's engineering crew were positioned at strategic points around the deck, disguised as lighting equipment. Everything was ready. Everything except Rublev, who'd spent the last hour trying to convince me to stay below deck. "This is madness," he said for the 3rd time, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "Vincenzo is over 600 years old. He's survived the Inquisition, the Napoleonic Wars, 2 world wars. He won't show mercy just because you're human." "I don't want mercy. I want recognition." I met his pale eyes directly. "If you try to force me to stay hidden, if you treat this challenge as being about protecting your property rather than respecting my autonomy, I will walk straight to those neutral witnesses and tell them everything. Vampire existence, feeding practices, territorial disputes. All of it documented and sent to every major news organization I can reach." His expression turned cold. "You'd destroy everything. Expose us to human authorities, trigger panic that would end in violence for both our species. Then don't make me accept that I have a stake in this outcome beyond being the prize you're fighting over." I softened slightly, touching his arm. "I've poisoned myself, created weapons, learned to fight. Let me use those advantages. Let me be your partner, not your possession." He was silent for a long moment, and I watched centuries of control instinct war with whatever he felt for me. Finally he nodded. "You participate. But if Vincenzo tries to kill you, I won't hold back to preserve your autonomy. Your life matters more than your principles." Agreed. The Corsini delegation arrived precisely at midnight. Vincenzo led them. Tall, elegant, with the kind of classical Italian features that belonged in Renaissance paintings. He wore an immaculate suit that probably cost more than my entire research budget, and moved with the fluid grace of something that had perfected predation across centuries. Behind him walked 3 subordinates, and between them, supported like a prisoner, was Royan. My ex-boyfriend looked terrible. 3 days of vampire transformation had changed him into something unstable, his eyes too red, his movements jerky with newborn lack of control. When he saw me, his expression shifted through confusion, desperation, and something that might have been recognition of what he'd become. "Svetlana," he called out, his voice cracking. "Please. I can still save you. Just come with me, let the Corsinis protect you from—" "Silence," Vincenzo commanded, and Royan's mouth snapped shut with the compulsion of an older vampire controlling a newborn. Vincenzo turned to Père Laurent with practiced courtesy. "We're here to settle the matter of territorial rights and custody of the Mertens woman. As is traditional, we invoke Blood Moon Challenge. Père Laurent's voice carried across the deck with unnatural projection. Rublev Romanov of the Eastern Syndicate. Vincenzo Corsini of the Mediterranean Coven. You both claim rights to this territory and to the human doctor Svetlana Mertens. State your terms. The victor controls all maritime routes from Gibraltar to the Bosphorus, Vincenzo said smoothly, and gains custody of Dr. Mertens, whose unique blood properties make her a strategic resource beyond price. I stepped forward before Rublev could respond, moving into the space between the two factions. Every vampire on that deck turned to stare, and I felt the weight of their attention like physical pressure. I object to those terms, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. I am Dr. Svetlana Mertens. Marine biologist, researcher, autonomous human being. My blood, my research, my choices. I'm not anyone's property, and I refuse to be treated as a prize in someone else's contest. Shocked silence. Père Laurent's ancient eyes widened fractionally, apparently the closest thing to surprise he'd shown in centuries. The neutral witnesses shifted, murmuring in languages I didn't recognize. No human has ever demanded standing at a blood moon challenge, Vincenzo said, but there was respect in his voice alongside the disbelief. Dr. Mertens, you don't understand what you're asking. This is vampire law, vampire tradition. That's being used to determine my fate without my consent. So either you recognize me as a participant with stake in the outcome, or I make sure this challenge becomes very public very quickly. I pulled out my phone, already queued to send documentation to my carefully curated list of journalists, government officials and scientific organizations. Your choice. Vincenzo looked to Père Laurent. Is this permissible? The ancient vampire considered for a long moment. Blood moon law doesn't explicitly forbid human participation. It's never occurred because humans aren't usually foolish enough to demand it. He looked at me with something that might have been approval. If Dr. Mertens wishes to speak for herself, tradition doesn't prevent it. Though it may kill her. I've made myself considerably harder to kill than you realize, I said. Then, addressing the assembled witnesses, I continued. I've spent the last 3 days poisoning my own blood with compounds derived from bioluminescent toxins. Any vampire who attempts to feed from me without my explicit consent will experience cellular decomposition. I've weaponized myself. I've made my biology too dangerous to simply take. Royan made a sound like a wounded animal. No. Lana, what have you done? They were going to turn you, make you immortal, let us be together forever. They were going to use me until I was no longer valuable, then dispose of me. I turned to face him fully. And you, Royan, they lied to you too. Your transformation was never meant to be permanent. Newborn vampires require tremendous resources to maintain. The Corsinis would have extracted whatever useful obsession you could provide, then let you burn in sunlight when you were no longer needed. I watched the truth hit him, watched his delusional certainty crack. He looked at Vincenzo with dawning horror. You said, you promised I'd be powerful, that I'd be worthy of her. You were a tool, Vincenzo said with casual cruelty. Useful for accessing Dr. Mertens, but ultimately disposable. Be grateful I turned you at all rather than simply killing you after you failed. Something in Royan snapped. He lunged at Vincenzo with newborn speed, decades of rage and humiliation compressed into one desperate attack. Vincenzo moved to counter, but Royan had surprise on his side. 3 days of being controlled, dismissed, used as puppet had taught him to hide his true intentions. His strike connected, claws raking across Vincenzo's perfect face, drawing blood that looked black under the red moon. The challenge arena erupted into chaos. Vincenzo's subordinates moved to restrain Royan, but Katia was faster. She intercepted with brutal efficiency, and I saw the mercy in how quickly she ended him. One strike to sever his spine, preventing the agonizing torture the Corsinis would have inflicted. Royan crumbled to ash, his newborn body unable to sustain true death with any grace. I should have felt something. Grief, vindication, horror. Instead, I felt only tired certainty. He'd chosen this path, chosen obsession over respect, control over love. And it had destroyed him. Blood has been spilled during challenge, Père Laurent announced. The duel proceeds. Rublev Romanov and Vincenzo Corsini fight until one yields or dies permanently. They came together like colliding storms. I'd seen Rublev fight before, but never like this. For centuries of accumulated skill unleashed against an opponent who matched him in age and exceeded him in pure viciousness. They moved too fast for human eyes to fully track, their bodies blurring across the deck in patterns of violence that seemed almost choreographed. But Vincenzo had one disadvantage he didn't know about. Rublev had fed from me multiple times, my poisoned blood still coursing through his system, giving him advantages that wouldn't manifest until pushed to his limits. The bioluminescent compounds that made me toxic to most vampires had integrated with Rublev's physiology in ways I'd carefully calculated. Enhanced speed, heightened reflexes, temporary resistance to the very UV weapons I'd created. When Vincenzo had Rublev pinned against the deck railing, when it looked like the ancient Italian vampire would finish this with one strike, I activated the UV drones. Light flooded the deck. Not normal illumination but concentrated ultraviolet that made vampires shriek and recoil. The blood moon's red light somehow amplified the effect, turning the entire arena into something that burned undead flesh on contact. Neutral witnesses scrambled for cover, hissing protests about interference. But I'd calculated the wavelengths precisely. The UV hurt Rublev. I saw him flinch, saw smoke rise from exposed skin. But it devastated Vincenzo, who hadn't built up any resistance through feeding from my enhanced blood. He stumbled backward, his perfect features cracking like aged porcelain. Rublev used those 3 seconds. He struck with precision that spoke of centuries of combat experience, not to kill but to dominate, to demonstrate superiority so complete that further fighting became meaningless. When the UV drones powered down, their batteries drained exactly as I'd designed. Rublev had Vincenzo on his knees, one hand wrapped around the Italian vampire's throat with enough pressure to threaten permanent death. "Yield," Rublev commanded. Vincenzo's eyes blazed with hatred, but he wasn't suicidal. "I yield the challenge. The Mediterranean routes are yours." "And Dr. Mertens?" Père Laurent prompted. Before Rublev could respond, I stepped forward again. "I speak for myself. Here are my terms." I addressed the neutral witnesses as much as the combatants. "My blood is mine to give or withhold. Any research derived from my biological properties requires my explicit consent and remains under my control. I maintain full autonomy over my body, my research, my life choices. Rublev's organization may protect me, but they don't own me. And these terms are enforced by all neutral covens present. Violation means immediate forfeiture of all territorial claims." Vincenzo laughed, the sound bitter. "A human dictating terms to ancient powers. Unprecedented." "Then let this be the precedent," I said. "Père Laurent, are my conditions acceptable under Blood Moon law?" The ancient vampire's expression was unreadable. Finally he spoke. "Blood Moon challenges traditionally determine ownership of contested resources. But if the resource in question demands autonomy and possesses means to enforce that demand." He glanced at where Royan's ashes still settled on the deck, at Vincenzo's burned flesh. "Then perhaps the law must evolve. I recognize Dr. Mertens' terms as binding. All present will witness and enforce them." The other coven representatives nodded, some reluctant, others intrigued. I'd just rewritten vampire law through nothing more than applied biology and refusal to accept their framework. Vincenzo rose to his feet with whatever dignity he could salvage. "The Corsini's withdraw from Mediterranean operations. We'll pay reparations for the attempt on Dr. Mertens. But understand, Dotteressa, you've made yourself into something unprecedented. Half weapon, half prize, fully neither. That kind of anomaly attracts attention from powers you haven't yet encountered. I'll deal with that when it comes." I turned to Rublev, saw pride and fear mixing in his expression. "Take me home." 3 months later, I stood on the deck of the research vessel Luminescence, watching the California coast appear on the horizon. My position at Scripps had started with a bang. My research on bioluminescent properties in human blood had been published in Nature with implications that rippled through multiple scientific disciplines. I'd carefully omitted any mention of vampires, framing everything through the lens of rare genetic mutations and evolutionary adaptation. But the vampire scientific community knew. I consulted with researchers from 7 different covens, helping them understand biology they'd lived with for centuries but never properly analyzed. I was building something unprecedented, a bridge between human and vampire science, between mortality and immortality. Rublev had kept his word. I lived in my own apartment in San Diego, maintained my human life and career, made my own choices about when and how we interacted. He visited regularly, coordinated his protection without being intrusive, and slowly, painfully, learned to respect boundaries that terrified him. "You're thinking too loud," said a familiar voice behind me. Katya had insisted on serving as my personal security, claiming she'd spent 300 years protecting fools and wanted to guard someone interesting for a change. "Whatever you're worrying about, stop. You earned your peace." "I'm not sure peace exists in my life anymore." "No. But you're free." "That's better." The ship docked at sunset. Rublev waited on the pier, looking incongruous among the marine biology students and research technicians in his expensive dark suit. When I reached him, he handed me a small box without preamble. "Come with me. There's something you need to see." He drove us to the harbor district, to a building I didn't recognize. When we entered, I realized it was the Eclipse Lounge, or rather, a perfect recreation of it. He'd bought the entire space, moved it from the cruise ship to San Diego, redesigned it with my input from sketches I'd made during idle moments. "I thought we should have a place that remembers where we started," he said quietly. "Where a brilliant scientist was almost destroyed and instead became something unprecedented." In the center of the lounge, on the same table where we'd first truly spoken, sat a small velvet box. "This isn't a marriage proposal," Rublev said before I could speak. "It's not a claim of ownership or a demand for transformation. It's a formal alliance, recognized by all major covens, that establishes you as my equal partner. Not consort, not possession, partner." I opened the box. Inside was a ring unlike anything I'd seen. A band of platinum containing a living bioluminescent organism, engineered to survive in a sealed environment, glowing faintly with the same blue-green light I'd studied in the deepest oceans. "Beauty that thrives in darkness," Rublev said softly. "Like you." I looked at the ring, at him, at the life we'd somehow built from impossible circumstances. "Ask me about transformation in 5 years," I said finally. "When you've proven you can respect my humanity as much as you desire my immortality. For now, I choose partnership. I choose to remain myself, fully human and fully yours, but never possessed. That's all I'm asking." He slipped the ring onto my finger, and I felt the tiny organism inside respond to my body heat, glowing brighter. "Though it terrifies me every day." "Good," I said, pulling him close. "Fear means you're paying attention." We stayed in the lounge until dawn threatened, talking about research projects and territorial politics and the strange life we were building together. When the sun finally rose, Rublev retreated to the protected spaces he'd built throughout the city, and I returned to my laboratory. By day, I studied bioluminescent organisms and taught marine biology to undergraduates who had no idea their professor consulted with vampires. By night, I worked with immortal scientists who were learning to see their own biology through human eyes. I published papers that advanced both fields without ever revealing the bridge between them. I was fully myself in both worlds. No longer dimmed, no longer small, no longer afraid of my own brilliance. Svetlana Mertens, marine biologist. Strategic asset. Weaponized intellect. Partner to ancient powers who'd learned to respect autonomy. I'd survived impossible pressure by becoming light itself, by transforming vulnerability into advantage, by refusing to be anything other than exactly what I chose to be. And every time I looked at the ring on my finger, at the tiny organism creating beauty in its sealed darkness, I remembered that survival wasn't about hiding from pressure. It was about learning to thrive in depths that would crush anything less adapted to the dark. Thank you for watching. We hope you sure enjoyed it. Don't forget to click that subscribe button, hit that like button, and share this video. Lastly, tell me where you are watching from. Also, click on the image on your screen to watch more beautiful, heartwarming stories and stay updated with our latest content.